Okay, I think my last two videos were probably too long, or I've been told that. So I'm going to try to keep this one a little more brief. It is on an ongoing controversy right now, and actually always, which is freedom of speech. Um, we have within the United States and around the world, actually, but here we have in our Constitution freedom of speech enshrined. And so that's our contract between the people and the government. But I am reading right now a book on John Stuart Mill, who was an essayist, writer, philosopher in 19th century England during the Victorian era. I think he's even referred to as the Victorian firebrand. He is also one of the people that you may probably don't know, but he is one of the people who defined what we call classical liberalism, not what people are calling liberalism right now and have for some time. Actually, they've kind of changed their name to progressives, which also comes from the 19th century, early 20th century. But anyway, Mill believed one of his seminal works was a piece called On Liberty, and he discussed at length speech, free speech. And I'm going to try to read some things here. But he says a vital precondition for individual self-development was unrestricted freedom of opinion and expression. Mill argued that progress depends on truth, that truth was more likely to emerge from a constant collision of opinions, and that freedom of speech was necessary to generate such collisions. He insisted that allowing even apparently foolish, dangerous, and false views to gain the public's ear would serve truth. For both teachers and learners go to sleep at their post as soon as there is no enemy in the field. An unchallenged view, even if correct, became, said Mill, a dead dogma, not a living truth. Mill suggested that in an exchange of opinions, it was rare for one side to be entirely right and the other entirely wrong. So, and he goes on, typically conflicting doctrines, instead of the one being true and the other false, share the truth between them only by bringing them into contact and conflict could any approximation of the whole truth be constructed. And then and he goes on, but the point is, and we have many people who don't seem to remember that's the reason for freedom of speech, is for people to argue, but to argue amicably, I guess, not to come to blows and not to dehumanize and demonize. And what we have, like, one thing that's interesting to me right now is there's a controversy going on with the guy who has a podcast named Joe Rogan, and a bunch of rockers, not a bunch, several, older, my age, rockers, rock and rollers have threatened and are taking their music libraries off of Spotify, which sponsors the podcast. And I find this interesting because it wasn't that too long ago, actually during the Clinton administration, that there were people who were determined to censor rock and roll. And they were determined to put warning labels on rock and roll. Then there were albums, 33 and a third, which are now back in favor of the long play albums. But and there were congressional hearings over that because some of the language used was foul and so forth. But and of all people, and some of the rockers were amazed. This was a guy named John Denver who was a good singer, but he was thought of as kind of softy type guy, he came out, and this surprised a lot of the congressional people, in favor of letting it all go. I mean, you've got to let people make their own decisions. And if you are afraid of the other person, if you cannot argue with them in a legitimate way without name calling and demonizing, then you have no faith in what you are espousing. So you have to remember that, and that's what school and colleges used to be about, was teaching us to use our minds and to think, for God's sake, to think things through and to look at all sides and to argue. I know, law school at one time, I don't know if this is true anymore, but an individual who wanted to become a lawyer had to learn to argue from either viewpoint. And that's what debate clubs were about, was learning to argue from either side of the issue. And if you can't do that, and you can only argue vehemently and crazily for your side, and there's no other side, there's no other truth, then you don't have any faith in what you're believing in. You have to be able to talk to the other person. You have to be able to listen to them, and you have to think it through. Then you can come to face and argue it out. And then they might have a good viewpoint. Your viewpoint on one era might be wrong. And that was one of the things. We used to talk about compromise. And the Senate used to be known as the body of compromise, where the crazy stuff came through the House, got into the Senate, and then it got hammered out, and then they got back together, and they come up with something where everybody was unhappy, but the bill usually kind of sort of worked. And I've got to slow this down now, but the thing to remember and the thing to think about is freedom of speech allows us to move on and to think. For God's sake, I have a once a week meeting with my son, who he and I do not agree on everything, but he points things out to me that I'm like, oh, okay. And the same thing goes the other way, And the thing is you've got to do that. I mean, there are beliefs and ideas, and you can't demonize, you can't put people down, and for God's sake, you can't put people down on the color of their skin. I mean, that's just stupid. I mean, I grew up when that was going on, and I thought we had worked through that, and now it's going crazy again, only it's the other way, So that has nothing to do with this. What's up here? What's between your ears? That's the muscle you have to learn to use. All the other muscle doesn't count if you can't think things through. And you can't think things through if you don't have something in opposition to you to exercise that muscle. And I'm going to stop this now, and y'all have a good day.